The morning of October 12, 1944, Staff Sergeant Marcus "Dutch" Kowalski did something that would have gotten him court-martialed in peacetime. He flipped his Sherman tank's entire turret configuration backwards. Not the turret itself, but everything inside it. The gunner's position, the loader's station, even the way the ammunition was stacked. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. His lieutenant called it suicidal. But 3 hours later, when German panzers rolled through the mist near Aachen, that backward setup would turn a standard M4 Sherman into the most lethal precision weapon on the battlefield. This is the story of how one man's obsession with angles, timing, and unconventional thinking transformed tank warfare in ways the Army manual never imagined. And it all started with a dead friend and a promise made in the mud. Marcus Kowalski wasn't supposed to be a tank commander. He was supposed to be a machinist in Detroit, building engines for Ford, living a quiet life with steady pay and predictable hours. But Pearl Harbor changed everything for 23 million American men, including a stocky Polish kid from Hamtramck, who'd never seen combat but understood machines better than most people understood their own families. Born in 1921, Dutch grew up in a neighborhood where English was the second language and hard work was the only religion that mattered. His father, Stefan, had immigrated from Krakow with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that precision was everything. Whether you were building a carburetor or laying brick, Stefan would say, there was only one way to do it. The right way. Dutch absorbed that philosophy like gospel. By age 16, he could strip and rebuild a transmission blindfolded. By 18, he was designing modifications that made engines run smoother, quieter, more efficiently than they had any right to. He saw mechanical systems not as collections of parts, but as living organisms with personalities, quirks, and hidden potential. When the draft notice arrived in January 1942, Dutch didn't fight it. He kissed his girlfriend Mary goodbye, promised his mother he'd write every week, and reported to Fort Knox for armored training. The Army took one look at his mechanical aptitude scores and assigned him to the 3rd Armored Division, tank crew, gunner position. But Dutch wasn't just any gunner. He studied every manual, memorized every specification, and spent his off-duty hours crawling through Sherman tanks like a surgeon studying anatomy. He learned that the M4 Sherman, while reliable and mass-produced, had limitations that killed American boys. Its armor was too thin. Its gun was adequate but not exceptional. And worst of all, its interior layout was designed for efficiency, not survival. The standard Sherman setup placed the gunner on the right side of the turret, with the loader on the left. The commander sat behind and above the gunner, with a clear view through his own periscope. Ammunition was stored in racks along the turret walls and in the floor. It was logical, tested, and approved by the finest military minds in America. It was also, Dutch realized, completely wrong. The problem wasn't the tank itself. The problem was how crews used it. Most Sherman commanders treated their tanks like mobile artillery pieces. They'd find a good firing position, stop, aim, shoot, and move. It worked against lighter German armor. But against the new Panthers and Tigers rolling off German production lines, it was suicide. Those monsters had thicker armor, bigger guns, and better optics. In a straight-up slugging match, the Sherman lost every time. Dutch saw the battlefield differently. He didn't see tanks as artillery. He saw them as precision instruments, capable of surgical strikes if operated by someone who understood their true potential. The key wasn't firepower. It was positioning, timing, and the ability to hit targets that other crews couldn't even see. That's where the backward setup came from. During training exercises in Louisiana, Dutch noticed something that bothered him. Every time his crew engaged targets at long range, the gunner had to crane his neck and adjust his position to get a clear sight picture. The standard layout worked fine for close-range fighting, but at distances beyond 800 yards, the gunner's vision was partially blocked by the gun's recoil mechanism and the commander's position above. Dutch started experimenting. During maintenance periods, when other crews were cleaning equipment or writing letters home, he was inside the turret with a measuring tape and notebook, calculating sight lines, studying angles, mapping every inch of available space. What if, he wondered, you could flip the entire crew configuration? What if the gunner sat where the loader normally worked, and the loader moved to the gunner's position? What if you restacked the ammunition to create clearer sight lines? What if you modified the commander's position to give the gunner unrestricted vision? On paper, it looked insane. The Army had tested thousands of configurations before settling on the standard layout. Generations of tank designers had optimized every element for maximum effectiveness. Who was Dutch Kowalski, a machinist from Detroit, to think he knew better than the experts? But Dutch had something the experts didn't have. He had desperation. Because during those training exercises in Louisiana, he'd made a friend. Tommy Marconi, a kid from Boston who could make anyone laugh, even in the middle of a simulated battle. Tommy was Dutch's loader, and they'd developed an almost telepathic connection. Dutch would think about a target, and Tommy would have the right shell ready before Dutch even asked for it. Tommy believed in Dutch's theories about precision gunnery. He volunteered to help with the experiments, even when it meant spending their free time crammed inside a hot metal box, testing sight lines and measuring angles. Tommy trusted Dutch's vision of turning their Sherman into something more than just another tank. Then came the letter from Tommy's mother. Tommy had been transferred to another crew, another tank, another unit. Standard Army procedure. Crews got shuffled, reassigned, moved around like chess pieces. Dutch tried not to think about it. But the separation felt wrong, like breaking up a team that had just learned to play together. 3 weeks later, Dutch got the news. Tommy's tank had been hit during a training accident. A live round, fired during what was supposed to be a practice exercise. Equipment malfunction. The shell had penetrated the turret and detonated inside. Tommy and 2 other crew members were killed instantly. Dutch read the accident report twice, then walked outside and vomited in the mud. Not from grief, though that was part of it. From rage, because the report mentioned something that made his blood boil. The crew had been engaging a target at long range. The gunner had trouble acquiring the target due to limited visibility through his sight. They'd moved closer to get a better shot. If Tommy had been in a tank with better long-range capability, he might have taken that shot from a safe distance. If the gunner had clearer sight lines, he might have hit the target on the first try instead of closing range for a better angle. Dutch made a promise that night, standing in the Louisiana rain, staring at the rows of Sherman tanks that looked identical but weren't. He was going to prove that his backwards setup worked. He was going to turn his Sherman into a precision weapon that could engage targets at ranges other crews couldn't even dream of. And he was going to make sure no other crew died because their tank couldn't do what it was supposed to do. The Army didn't care about Dutch's theories, but Dutch didn't need the Army's permission to be ready. And when his unit shipped out for Europe 6 months later, he carried detailed diagrams, measurements, and modifications plans in his kit bag. All he needed was the right moment to put them to the test. The moment came sooner than Dutch expected. By September 1944, his unit was grinding through the Siegfried Line, facing the kind of entrenched German resistance that turned every village into a fortress and every hill into a killing field. The Wehrmacht had learned to use the terrain like a weapon, positioning their panzers in defilade positions where only the gun barrel showed, making them nearly impossible to hit with conventional tactics. Dutch's crew had been together for 2 months now. There was Rodriguez, the loader, a quiet kid from New Mexico who moved like lightning when shells started flying. Henderson, the driver, grew up on a farm in Iowa and could coax their Sherman through terrain that would stop other tanks cold. And Lieutenant Morrison, the tank commander, a West Point graduate who was smart enough to listen when his men had ideas that worked. Morrison had noticed Dutch's modifications early on. The way Dutch had repositioned his gunner's seat, angled it differently to give him better sight lines through the periscope. The custom ammunition rack he'd built that kept shells organized by type and within easy reach. The small mirror system he'd rigged to eliminate blind spots in the turret. Most officers would have ordered him to return everything to standard configuration. Morrison was different. He'd seen Dutch's shooting during their advance through France. Targets that other crews missed, Dutch hit on the first shot. ranges that forced other Shermans to close distance and expose themselves. Dutch could handle from concealed positions. But the full backward setup, that was something Dutch had never attempted in combat. It required trust, coordination, and perfect timing between crew members who had to essentially relearn their jobs inside the turret. One mistake, one moment of confusion, and they'd be dead. The opportunity came outside Aachen, during what intelligence called a reconnaissance in force. German armor had been reported in the area, but nobody knew exactly where or how much. Dutch's tank was part of a 4-tank platoon assigned to probe enemy positions along a ridgeline that overlooked the approaches to the city. The morning was cold and gray, with mist hanging in the valleys like smoke from distant fires. Perfect conditions for an ambush, which is exactly what Dutch suspected they were walking into. German tactics had evolved since Normandy. They no longer met American armor head-on. Instead, they waited, let the Shermans advance into carefully prepared kill zones, then opened fire from concealed positions at ranges where American return fire was ineffective. Dutch studied the terrain ahead through his periscope. Rolling hills covered with scattered trees, small farming villages, stone walls that could hide a dozen panzers. The kind of ground where you could be looking directly at an enemy tank and never see it until the muzzle flash lit up your world. That's when he made the decision. He keyed the intercom and spoke to his crew in the calm, measured voice they'd learned to trust. "We're going to try something different today. Rodriguez, I need you to switch positions with me. Henderson, keep us moving, but slow and steady. Lieutenant, I'm going to need you to spot for me from a different angle." Morrison's voice crackled through the headset. "Dutch, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking the Germans are up there waiting for us to get close enough for a killing shot. But what if we don't get close? What if we take them out from ranges they're not expecting?" The backward setup took 12 minutes to implement. Rodriguez moved to Dutch's normal position on the right side of the turret, but his job now was to load and pass ammunition, not to spot targets. Dutch positioned himself where Rodriguez usually worked, but from this angle, he had an unobstructed view through the main gun sight and could traverse the turret without interference from the commander's position. Morrison moved to the left side of the turret, where he could use his own periscope to spot targets and call out ranges without blocking Dutch's sight picture. The ammunition was restacked so that armor-piercing rounds were immediately accessible, with high-explosive shells in a secondary rack. It looked chaotic to anyone who didn't understand the theory. But Dutch had calculated every angle, measured every sight line. From his new position, he could engage targets at ranges up to 1,200 yards with precision that the standard setup couldn't match. The slight delay in target acquisition was offset by dramatically improved accuracy at long range. Other crews in the platoon watched the reconfiguration with mixture of curiosity and concern. Radio chatter was minimal, but Dutch could imagine the conversations in the other tanks. Kowalski's finally lost it, playing around with his setup when we should be moving. Hope he knows what he's doing. Dutch hoped so too, because the mist was starting to lift, and through his sight, he could see the silhouettes of what looked like farm buildings on the ridge ahead. Buildings that were positioned too perfectly, spaced too evenly to be natural. Buildings that could hide a dozen German tanks. Henderson eased the Sherman forward at walking speed, tracks grinding softly against the frozen ground. The other tanks in the platoon moved in loose formation, spreading out to avoid presenting a concentrated target. Standard doctrine, textbook advance. Dutch adjusted his sight picture and waited for the Germans to reveal themselves. In the backward setup, he felt different, more connected to the gun, more aware of the tank's movement, more confident in his ability to make the kind of shot that would matter when the shooting started. The first German tank appeared at 10:47 a.m., exactly where Dutch expected it. Not the full tank, just the gun barrel and a sliver of turret, barely visible behind a stone wall 800 yards away. A perfect hull-down position that made it nearly impossible to hit with conventional gunnery. Dutch didn't hesitate. He'd been preparing for this shot for months. The mathematics were already calculated in his head. Range, wind, target movement. the slight upward angle required to clear the stone wall and hit the thin strip of armor that was exposed. He squeezed the trigger, and the Sherman rocked back on its suspension as the 76mm gun roared. The armor-piercing shell crossed 800 yards in less than 2 seconds and struck the German Panzer exactly where Dutch had aimed. The explosion sent a column of black smoke into the gray morning sky. The backward setup had just claimed its first kill. But Dutch was already traversing left, looking for the next target, because German tanks never traveled alone. And somewhere in that maze of stone walls and farm buildings, more panzers were waiting. The second panzer revealed itself 30 seconds later. A Panzer IV, its commander clearly shaken by the destruction of his companion tank. Instead of maintaining concealment, the German crew made a fatal error. They tried to relocate, exposing their full profile as they backed out from behind cover. Dutch tracked the movement through his sight. From his backwards position, he could follow the target's path without the visual obstructions that plagued standard Sherman configurations. The German tank was moving at an angle that would have been nearly impossible to engage accurately from a conventional gunner's position. But Dutch's modified setup gave him the sight lines he needed. Rodriguez had the next armor-piercing round ready before Dutch even called for it. The loader had adapted to the reversed configuration faster than anyone expected, moving with practiced efficiency despite the unfamiliar layout. Morrison spotted the range at 750 yards and called out the target's direction of movement. The second shot struck the Panzer IV in the side as it attempted to reach a new firing position. The German tank shuddered, stopped, and began to burn. Smoke poured from its engine compartment as the crew bailed out, running across the open ground toward the tree line. But Dutch wasn't watching the fleeing Germans. He was already scanning for the next threat because his backward setup allowed him to acquire targets faster than conventional gunnery methods. The modified sight lines meant he could sweep larger arcs without repositioning his entire body, and the ammunition arrangement let Rodriguez feed him shells in a steady rhythm that other crews couldn't match. The third contact came from an unexpected direction. A German tank destroyer, probably a Jagdpanzer, had been concealed in a depression to the right of the main engagement area. Its long gun was already traversing toward Dutch's Sherman when Morrison spotted the movement. Contact right, 900 yards, hull down behind that ridge line. This was the shot that would prove whether Dutch's theories worked under real combat pressure. 900 yards was beyond the effective range of most Sherman crews, especially against a well-concealed target that presented minimal silhouette. The Jagdpanzer's frontal armor was thick enough to deflect anything but a perfect hit, and its gun could penetrate Sherman armor at distances where return fire was ineffective. Dutch studied the target through his sight. Just the gun barrel and a small portion of the fighting compartment were visible above the ridge. The angle was severe, requiring precise elevation calculations and perfect timing. In a standard Sherman configuration, this shot would have been nearly impossible due to sightline restrictions and the awkward positioning required to engage such a distant target. But the backward setup changed everything. Dutch could lean into his sight without interference, track the target smoothly as it made minute adjustments to its position, and maintain visual contact while Rodriguez prepared the ammunition. The modified commander's position allowed Morrison to spot without blocking Dutch's view, creating a coordination that felt more like a single organism than 4 separate crew members. Dutch made the calculations instinctively. Wind speed, target distance, the slight upward trajectory needed to clear the intervening terrain. He'd practiced these shots hundreds of times in his mind, working through the mathematics during quiet moments when other crews were resting or writing letters home. The Jagdpanzer fired first. Its shell screamed over Dutch's Sherman, missing by less than 10 feet and exploding against a stone wall behind them. Fragments peppered the tank's rear deck, but caused no significant damage. The German crew was good, but they'd underestimated the range and fired high. Dutch didn't flinch at the near miss. He held his sight picture, made a final adjustment for the target's slight movement, and fired. The armor-piercing round traced a perfect arc across 900 yards of battlefield and struck the Jagdpanzer exactly where the gun mantlet met the hull. The impact penetrated the armor and detonated inside the fighting compartment. The German tank destroyer erupted in flames. Its ammunition store cooked off in a series of secondary explosions that sent the gun barrel spinning through the air like a javelin. The blast was so violent that Dutch felt the shock wave through his tank's armor plating. 3 enemy vehicles destroyed in less than 5 minutes, all at ranges that conventional Sherman tactics couldn't effectively engage. The backward setup wasn't just working, it was revolutionizing how Dutch's crew fought their tank. But the engagement wasn't over. Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom with new contacts. Multiple targets, moving in formation, approaching from the north. German reinforcements, probably alerted by the sounds of battle, were converging on their position. Dutch traversed his gun toward the new threat axis and felt the familiar calm that came with absolute confidence in his equipment and crew. The backward setup had transformed his Sherman from a standard medium tank into something unprecedented. A precision instrument capable of engaging multiple targets at extended ranges with accuracy that defied conventional wisdom. Rodriguez was already stacking different ammunition types in the modified rack system, alternating armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds based on the target priorities Morrison was calling out. Henderson kept the tank moving in a slow, steady pattern that made them harder to hit, while maintaining stability for long-range gunnery. Through his sight, Dutch could see the approaching German formation. 4 tanks, moving in a disciplined advance formation that suggested experienced crews. They were still at extreme range, over 1,000 yards, but closing steadily. In a few minutes, they'd be close enough to bring effective fire on Dutch's position. Most Sherman crews would have withdrawn at this point, falling back to more defensible terrain or calling for artillery support. The odds were too heavily stacked against a single tank, engaging 4 enemy vehicles simultaneously. But Dutch's backward setup had given him capabilities that changed those odds fundamentally. He selected his first target, the lead German tank, and began his calculations. Range, deflection, the complex mathematics of engaging a moving target at distances where even minor errors would result in complete misses. The backwards configuration allowed him to track the target smoothly, while Rodriguez prepared the ammunition sequence they'd need for rapid engagement of multiple vehicles. This was the moment Dutch had been preparing for since Tommy's death. The chance to prove that unconventional thinking, precise execution, and absolute trust between crew members could overcome superior numbers and firepower. His Sherman was about to face 4 German tanks in the kind of long-range engagement that would have been impossible with standard configuration and tactics. The morning mist was clearing completely now, giving both sides perfect visibility across the battlefield. German machine gun positions that had been hidden were now visible on the ridgeline. American infantry that had been advancing in support of the tank platoon were taking cover behind stone walls and farm buildings. The entire engagement was expanding into a full-scale battle. But at the center of it all was Dutch's Sherman, configured backwards, crewed by men who had learned to fight their tank like no other crew in the European theater. They were about to demonstrate that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the biggest gun or the thickest armor. Sometimes it's the willingness to throw away the manual and rebuild everything from scratch. From scratch. Dutch selected the lead German panzer and held his breath. 1,200 yards. The furthest shot he'd ever attempted in combat. At this range, the target looked like a toy through his sight. A gray speck crawling across the landscape with agonizing slowness. But the backward setup gave him advantages no other Sherman crew possessed. From his modified position, Dutch could track the target without the visual obstructions that plagued standard configurations. His sight picture remained clear as he followed the German tank's movement, calculating the lead time needed to intercept a target moving at that distance. Rodriguez had armor-piercing rounds ready in the precise sequence Dutch had requested, each shell positioned for immediate loading without fumbling or delay. The mathematics flowed through Dutch's mind like water. Target speed, roughly 15 miles per hour. Wind from the northwest at 8 knots. Slight upward trajectory to account for the elevation difference between his position and the target. The shell would take nearly 3 seconds to cover the distance, which meant he had to aim at empty ground ahead of the German tank and trust his calculations. Henderson maintained their steady movement, keeping the Sherman mobile enough to avoid becoming a stationary target while providing the stability Dutch needed for precision shooting. Morrison watched the other 3 German tanks through his periscope, calling out their positions and movements so Dutch could prioritize his engagement sequence. The lead Panzer was now 1,100 yards away and closing. Dutch made his final adjustments, feeling the familiar weight of the trigger under his finger. Everything depended on this shot. Miss, and the German formation would close to effective range where their superior armor and firepower would overwhelm his single tank. Hit, and he might be able to disrupt their advance long enough to engage the remaining vehicles. He squeezed the trigger. The Sherman bucked against its suspension as the gun roared. The recoil was absorbed differently in the backwards configuration, but Dutch had trained for this, adapted his body position to handle the forces involved. Through his sight, he watched the armor-piercing round arc across the battlefield, a dark streak against the gray morning sky. The shell struck the lead German tank center mass, penetrating the frontal armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The Panzer lurched to a halt as smoke began pouring from its engine vents. Secondary explosions rippled through the vehicle as ammunition cooked off, sending the turret spinning sideways like a discarded toy. But Dutch was already traversing right, acquiring the second target. The remaining German tanks had seen their leader destroyed and were now maneuvering frantically, trying to close range while presenting minimal silhouettes. Their commanders had realized they were facing something unexpected. A Sherman crew capable of accurate fire at distances they'd assumed were safe. The second Panzer was turning to present its angled frontal armor, a defensive maneuver that would deflect most incoming rounds. But Dutch's backward setup allowed him to track the turning movement and select the precise moment when the tank's side armor became vulnerable. The angle was severe, requiring split-second timing and perfect aim. Rodriguez slammed the next round into the breach as Dutch held his sight on the turning German tank. The coordination between gunner and loader had reached an almost telepathic level, each man anticipating the other's movements in the cramped turret space. Morrison continued his running commentary on target positions, while Henderson adjusted their heading to maintain optimal firing angles. The second shot crossed 900 yards and struck the German Panzer just behind the drive sprocket, penetrating the side armor and destroying the tank's mobility. The vehicle ground to a halt, its left track blown completely off the road wheels. Smoke began seeping from the crew compartment, but the tank's gun was still operational and traversing toward Dutch's position. Now came the real test of the backwards configuration. 2 German tanks remained mobile and were coordinating their approach, trying to bracket Dutch's Sherman between converging lines of fire. Standard doctrine called for withdrawal at this point, but Dutch had spent months calculating the angles and timing needed to engage multiple targets in rapid succession from a single firing position. The third German tank fired first, its shell screaming past the Sherman's turret and exploding against a stone wall 50 yards behind them. The shot was close enough to shower the tank with fragments, but Dutch didn't flinch from his sight picture. He was tracking the 4th Panzer, which was attempting to flank left while the 3rd tank provided covering fire. This was the moment that separated precision gunnery from simple marksmanship. Dutch had to engage the flanking tank before it reached a position where it could penetrate his Sherman side armor, while simultaneously avoiding the covering fire from the 3rd vehicle. The timing had to be perfect, the shot placement exact, or his crew would be dead within the next 30 seconds. Dutch fired at the flanking Panzer just as it crested a small rise, exposing its full profile for a brief moment. The armor-piercing round caught the German tank in the turret ring, that vulnerable junction between the rotating turret and the hull. The impact jammed the turret mechanism and started a fire that quickly spread to the ammunition storage. 3 German tanks destroyed or disabled in less than 8 minutes. But the 4th Panzer was still operational and had finally closed to effective range. Its commander was experienced, probably a veteran of the Eastern Front, and he was using every trick in the German tactical manual to make his tank a difficult target. Dutch traversed left to engage the final threat, but his ammunition situation was becoming critical. Rodriguez was down to his last 3 armor-piercing rounds, with only high explosive shells remaining after that. Against the thick frontal armor of a German panzer, high-explosive rounds would be useless except for harassment fire. The German commander seemed to sense this. Instead of pressing his attack, he was maneuvering to prolong the engagement, forcing Dutch to expend his remaining effective ammunition while staying outside the range where return fire could penetrate his armor. It was a sound tactical decision that might have worked against a conventional Sherman crew. But Dutch's backward setup included modifications that went beyond just repositioning crew members and equipment. He'd studied German tank design extensively, memorizing the location of every vulnerable spot, every weak point that could be exploited with precise shot placement. The frontal armor might be thick, but there were gaps around the gun mantlet, weak spots where armor plates joined, vision ports that could be targeted to blind or disable the crew. Dutch selected his target point carefully. Not the center of the German tank's frontal armor, where his shell would simply bounce off, but a small gap where the gun mantlet met the turret face. The opening was less than 6 inches wide at 700 yards, requiring accuracy that bordered on the impossible. But the backwards configuration gave him the sight picture and stability he needed to attempt such a precise shot. Dutch squeezed the trigger one final time. The shell found its mark, threading through that impossible gap and detonating inside the German turret. When the smoke cleared, 4 enemy tanks lay burning across the battlefield. The backward setup had worked beyond every expectation, transforming one Sherman into a precision instrument that could engage targets other crews couldn't even see. Sometimes the greatest innovations come not from following the manual, but from a mechanic's son who understood that machines, like men, have untapped potential waiting to be discovered.